before the betrayals, before the bodies, before the courtroom whispers and YouTube confessions. There was just a kid from Bensonhurst, a quiet boy, small, watching. He learned early that loyalty could kill you and silence could save you. He rose beside John Gotti. He helped murder a boss. He brought down the mafia from inside. And then he lived. This is not a redemption story. This is the story of a man who survived everything and became something else, a voice, a warning, a ghost that never left. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. The room was too quiet for a man like Sammy Gravano outside. Brooklyn was breathing its usual noise sirens pulsing somewhere near Bay Ridge. Trucks growling across the wet asphalt of Flatbush Avenue. Pigeons scattering in a clatter of wings. Off grimy rooftops. But in this room, deep in the belly of a federal safe house, there was no such chaos, only stillness. And a tape recorder that wouldn't stop whispering. Sammy sat stiffly in a folding chair, hands folded tight in his lap. Across the table, an FBI agent adjusted the tape player's volume. The reel clicked forward, static, then a voice thicker, then smoke heavier than leather. It was John Gotti. "Sammy, he's got to go," the voice said. "He's out of control." Gravano didn't flinch, not visibly, but something permanent shifted in his eyes. The voice continued, almost amused. "That guy's a stone-cold killer. He's done too much and too loud." Sammy's jaw set hard. For years he'd called this man the boss. He'd buried bodies for him, sworn silence for him, built a criminal empire under his flag. But now, in this sterile room of white walls and bulletproof windows, Sammy heard the truth spelled out in tape hiss and betrayal. He wasn't a brother, he was a liability. The agent leaned forward slowly, like baiting a bear. "You know what this means, Sammy?" Gravano blinked. His fingers twitched once against the tabletop. Not fear, not confusion, calculation. He'd always believed in the life, the code, omerta. Silence was holy, betrayal, a sin beyond words. But what did loyalty mean when the man at the top played both sides? What did honor mean if it only ran one way? He remembered sitting beside Gotti at the Ravenite Social Club, sipping espresso over murder talk like it was Tuesday lunch. He remembered burying Frank Boshier, pulling the trigger on Louis de Bono, dragging bones across Staten Island dirt, while Gotti grinned in silk. And now he was a problem. Gravano stood up, walked across the room, and turned his back to the agents. The walls didn't move. The air didn't change. He was thinking not whether he could do it, but if he should. If he crossed this line, he knew there was no return. He'd be Judas in every headline, a ghost in every borough. Every made man in America would curse his name for generations. Gravano, the bull who broke the pact, the killer who turned. But maybe this was always the end. Maybe the moment you got too high in the mafia, you were already marked. He turned, "I'll testify." There was no drama in his voice, no grandstanding, just cold, controlled commitment. The agents didn't smile, they nodded, the room stayed quiet. But far beyond that room, beyond the courthouse and the headlines and the prison cells that waited like open mouths, the world of organized crime shook, not with thunder, with silence. The silence of a man who had once stood at the right hand of the most powerful gangster in America, now walking into a courtroom, not with chains around his wrists, but with truth in his mouth. Salvatore Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino crime family, had just signed the death certificate for the last golden age of the American mafia. But to understand how he got here, to understand why this man, read in the codes of honor and silence, could choose betrayal, we need to go back before the suits, before the gold, before the murders and the meetings and the headlines, back to a skinny kid on a Bensonhurst stoop, watching older boys with switchblade swagger past him, watching his father sweat through honest work that never paid enough, watching respect being handed not to the righteous but to the feared. Gravano had been many things in his life: an errand boy, a soldier, a builder, a butcher of men. But in this moment inside that federal room, he was something no mafia man was ever supposed to be. Free, not safe, not proud, not even alive in the way he once knew life to be, but free of gaudy, of codes, of pretense. The tapes had done their work, and now he would do his. The agents led him down a corridor, quiet boots over tile. A new name waited, a new file, a new set of rules, but the past followed like smoke in his collar. The voices, the laughter. The moment Gotti shook his hand and called him our guy. The gunshot that ended Castellano's life at Sparks Steakhouse. The white linen napkin falling like snow across red-stained sidewalk. Every step forward now was a step away from the graveyard of Cosa Nostra, because what Sammy had done wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. He had erased the myth, the one that said the mafia would never break, that its men would die before they spoke. That silence was stronger than fear, but Sammy knew the truth. He had seen it in Gotti's eyes in those tapes. Even the Dapper Dan was afraid of losing his throne, afraid of rivals, afraid even of Sammy. And if Gotti could betray, then Sammy could speak. His voice would not shake. It would not tremble. It would cut as surely as any bullet he'd ever fired. It would bring down a kingdom built in blood and stitched together with lies. The press would call it the betrayal of the century. The commission would curse his name, but Sammy wouldn't care, because in that room with the tapes playing and the suits watching and the weight of history pressing down on his lungs, he had stopped being a gangster. He had become something else entirely, the executioner of an era, and like all executioners, he would walk alone, but he would walk, and the mafia would never be the same again. Brooklyn in the 1950s was a place of rituals. The clatter of shoes on concrete stoops at sundown, the hum of radios leaking Sinatra through open windows, the rusted rattle of ice trucks on Avenue U. It was a borough of workers' dock hands, butchers, tailors' men who came home with grease under their fingernails, and sons they didn't know how to talk to. Behind every glass of homemade wine and muttered Ave Maria, there was an unspoken truth. If you wanted more, you'd never get it the honest way. Salvatore Gravano was born there, in Bensonhurst, 1945. The war had just ended, but something else was beginning in a row house tucked between 79th and 17th Avenue. The Gravanos weren't starving, but they weren't sleeping well either. His father, Giolando, was a tailor, proud, reserved. He believed in rules, in tradition, but the neighborhood believed in something stronger, survival. Sammy was a quiet boy at first, too quiet, some said. His teachers mistook his silence for laziness. In truth, he couldn't read. Letters twisted on the page. Dancing into confusion, they said he was dumb, so he used his fists instead. By third grade, he had already cracked another boy's cheekbone in a playground scuffle. The teachers sent notes home. His father whipped him, but there was a cold, stubborn calm in Sammy's eyes that no punishment seemed to shake. There was something else, loyalty, not to school or to God, but to friends, to anyone who made him feel seen. He would fight for them, break skin for them, steal for them, not out of recklessness, but because the world didn't give, it tested. And Sammy learned early that to survive those tests, you had to hit back first and harder. By age 10, he wasn't just brawling, he was watching, listening. The older boys called him Bull because he lowered his head before a punch. like a charging animal, but inside he wasn't blind rage, he was precision. He noticed things, who got slapped at home and who didn't, who flinched when sirens wailed, who carried knives taped inside their boots. He remembered every name. There were two Brooklyns in the 1950s, the one in church and the one on the street. Sammy walked the line between both. Sunday mornings he knelt at the altar beside his mother, her gloved hand squeezing his own. But on weekday afternoons, he stalked schoolyards and stoops with the neighborhood gang, his school bag empty except for a tire iron. Then came the Rampers. The Rampers weren't the biggest crew in Bensonhurst, but they were the most volatile. Young, angry, and Italian, no suits, no structure. Just knuckles and motor oil and a belief that the cops didn't care and the city didn't matter. Sammy joined. Then, at 13, his initiation wasn't formal, and there was no ceremony, just a joyride in a stolen Buick, 3 cigarettes, and a broken window at a bodega that refused them beer. After that, he belonged. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the wildest, but when things got hot, the older boys started to listen to him. There was something in the way he stood still. When others ran, something in the way his voice dropped when it should have risen. They'd be ready to bolt, blood on their shirts, a siren in the distance, and Sammy would say, not yet. He wasn't fearless, he was calculating. He didn't enjoy the violence, but he understood it. It was a currency, and if spent correctly, it bought you things the world wouldn't otherwise offer. Silence, obedience, respect. He stole tires, beat up rival kids, held lookout for corner hustlers, nothing major, nothing headline-worthy, but by 15 his name was known on more than one street corner, and not just by kids. The local bookie, Louis Mack, started nodding at him when he passed. A small-time Shylock on Bath Avenue gave him $5 just for keeping an eye out. These weren't offers, they were invitations, and Sammy knew it. He never spoke about it at home. His father still believed in honest labor and family dinners and keeping the name clean. But Sammy already knew the truth. Clean names didn't eat any better than dirty ones, and they sure as hell didn't live longer. At 16, he beat a man twice his age unconscious for smacking his cousin during an argument over a loan. The man's name was Ernesto. Everyone knew him, ran numbers, had pull for 3 days. Sammy waited to get jumped, to be punished, but nothing happened. Then one morning he found an envelope on his stoop inside. $20 and a note that said, "You got balls." That was Brooklyn's way of saying, "You're in." Still, school dragged on. He was failing everything. Teachers had long since given up on him. One day, in the middle of math class, he walked out, didn't slam the door, didn't say a word, just left and never returned. He took a job as an assistant in a plumbing shop, not because he cared about the work, but because the shop was owned by a man named Charlie the Beard, a Gambino associate with a reputation for quiet power. Sammy watched him, the way he moved, the way people leaned in when he spoke. He wasn't big, he wasn't loud, but he carried presence like a weapon. Sammy saw it and thought, that's the kind of man who survives. That same year, the Rampers stole a truck furniture worth maybe $10,000. It was supposed to be a quick grab and sell, but something went wrong. One of the guys got mouthy, police got a tip, names were tossed around. Sammy didn't flinch. He said nothing, even when questioned, especially then. Word got back to Charlie the Beard. A week later, Sammy was told to show up at a garage on 18th Avenue. Inside, 3 men waited. No smiles. They asked him about the truck, about the silence, about why he didn't brake. Sammy shrugged and said, "Nobody asked." It wasn't a test of loyalty, it was a test of temperament, and he passed. From that point on, Gravano had one foot in, not made, not official, but noticed, watched, and slowly included. But what set him apart wasn't muscle. It was discipline. He didn't drink to sloppiness, didn't gamble like a maniac, didn't brag. When he punched only once. When he stole, he made sure no one talked. He wasn't just another street kid swinging wildly. He was becoming something else, something sharper. Still, his father disapproved. Fights at the dinner table, raised voices, disappointed glances, but Sammy never shouted back, never cursed. It wasn't rebellion, it was detachment. A quiet resignation that the old world his father believed in honor through sweat, respect through restraint had no place in this city anymore. Brooklyn didn't run on good intentions, it ran on fear, and Sammy Gravano was learning to be fluent. In it at 19, he joined the army, briefly stationed in Georgia. But the structure chafed. He came back home, changed, but not soft. If anything, more certain than ever, the rampers were fading. Sammy was too smart for them now. He wanted more in the years that followed. He'd find it in new crews, in contracts, in bodies buried in silence. With everything he became the man who stood at the shoulder of Gotti, who built an empire of concrete and cash, who flipped and burned the mafia from the inside, began here, in Bensonhurst, among chipped stoops and swinging fists, between broken street lamps and open fire hydrants, with a boy who couldn't read but could sense a lie from across the street. Sammy Gravano wasn't born a gangster. Brooklyn made him one, and the world never saw him coming. It began with a look, not a shove, not a threat. Just a look, a kind of glance that lingers a moment too long, like someone testing the weight of your name. It was 1966, in a small nightclub off 86th Street in Bensonhurst, the kind of place that didn't have a name outside, only a steel door and a man who decided if you belonged. Gravano was there that night, not as a guest, not as security, but as something else. A presence. He wasn't made yet, not officially, but in Brooklyn, there were whispers, and sometimes whispers traveled faster than bullets. The man who gave the look was Nicholas Sabetta, a street punk, half drunk, full of attitude. He'd tried shaking down the club owner for protection money, said it came from up high. It didn't. It came from desperation, and desperation in this world was dangerous. Sammy knew the rules. You didn't act without permission. You didn't take life unless the family said it was owed. But that night, in the heat of flashing lights and sweat, Sabetta pulled a knife. It grazed the arm of the bartender, a friend of Sammy's since the Rampers' days. The decision wasn't calculated, it wasn't political. It was pure instinct. Gravano drew his weapon, .38 snub-nose, and fired twice into Sabetta's chest before the man even reached the exit. Blood splashed across the club's back wall, the kind that doesn't wash out. Even when the paint's red, the music kept playing, muffled now by shock and stillness. The crowd didn't scream, they just froze. Because in neighborhoods like this, silence was the only way out alive. The club emptied in whispers, and by morning, word had traveled farther than any body ever could. Sammy hadn't just killed a man. He'd made a statement. Within days, the Colombo family knew his name. Joey Russo, a soldier under Joe Colombo. Himself sent for him. They met in a garage on Shore Parkway, concrete floors. Oil-stained, nothing fancy. Joey didn't offer a seat, just stood by the trunk of a Cadillac and lit a cigarette. "You did that clean," he said. Sammy said nothing, just nodded. "You got loyalty nerve, but you also gotta learn when it's your place, and when it ain't." There was no anger in his voice, just education. Gravano understood. That was the world. Take your shot, but always know who owns the bullet. Still, the Colombo crew started letting him in. Quiet jobs, collections, observations. He wasn't buttoned, but he was noticed. And in the mafia, that was step one. He'd married Deborah around this time. She was local, sharp, loyal. She didn't ask questions, but she saw things she knew not to press. Gravano loved her in the only. way a man like him could, completely, and with walls a mile thick. They moved into a modest place in Diker Heights. Brick, 2 floors, a quiet front. Inside, Sammy built something different. A company, Woodside Construction, that began as a way to keep busy, but it became something more. A front, yes, but also a lesson. In permits, in cash flow, in the power of a clean suit and a dirty handshake. Sammy learned to move money like water quiet, invisible, essential. Laundering wasn't just about scrubbing cash. It was about making crime look like order. He'd meet inspectors at lunch, slip envelopes beneath invoices, and wear a heart at when city officials dropped by. The books balanced, the projects finished, and all the while, Sammy was stacking reputation. In 2 worlds on the street, he was the bull, unflinching, efficient, cold when needed. In the boardroom, he was Mr. Gravano, measured, confident, impossible to pin down. But Columbo's crew had friction, internal fights, whispered doubts. And then in 1971, the boss himself, Joe Colombo, was shot in the head at a rally in Manhattan. He didn't die, but he was never the same. It was the opening Sammy had been waiting for. Through quiet channels, he made contact with the Gambino family, specifically with Aniello Della Croce Neal. They called him the underboss, the man in the shadows behind Paul Castellano. Gravano respected Della Croce, not because he was powerful, but because he was steady, a true believer in Cosa Nostra, a man who didn't need to yell to be feared. Their first meeting was brief, a diner, nothing flashy, 2 coffees, 1 nod. Della Croce saw what others missed. Sammy wasn't just muscle, he was a builder, a planner, and he had that rarest of traits in a violent world. Patience. By 1973, Gravano had officially transferred into the Gambino family. It wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible. Families were like kingdoms. Sometimes men swore loyalty to new thrones. With the Gambinos, Sammy grew fast. He built the Brooklyn connection, a network of construction rackets, union bribes, and trucking scams. No blood, unless needed, no noise. Unless it served a purpose, violence to Gravano was never emotional. It was logistical, and that made him more dangerous than anyone shouting on a street corner. In 1975, there was a contract. An associate named Tommy Sparrow was causing problems. Petty thefts, late payments. He insulted a made man's wife during a dinner in Staten Island. Drunken, loud, careless, the Gambino crew discussed options, warnings, fines, but the final call came down. He goes. Sammy volunteered. Quietly, they met in a parking lot off Cropsey Avenue, behind a shuttered appliance store. No ceremony, no last words, just a walk between 2 men and a sudden shift in air pressure. Gravano pulled the trigger behind Tommy's left ear. The body dropped. The noise didn't echo. He lit a cigarette and drove home. Later that week, he sat down for dinner with Deborah and his daughter, Corinne. Meatballs, red wine, bread. The table was warm, the lighting soft. And not once did he speak of where he'd been or what he'd done. He carved the bread, passed the salt, and smiled gently as Corinne told him about school. The split had begun. There was the Sammy who executed people in silence, and the Sammy who held his daughter's hand across a restaurant booth. He kept both men alive in the same body, and he kept them separate. That, more than any bullet, was his gift. By the late 1970s, Gravano was running multiple construction firms, manipulating bids for multi-million-dollar city contracts. He'd sit at tables with architects in the morning and collect envelopes from bookies at night. One day, a developer from Manhattan tried to strong-arm him, offered a bribe to back off a union job. Sammy declined. The man insisted, said he had friends in City Hall. A week later, his office burned down. No arrests were made. Sammy never mentioned it again. It was during these years that his reputation solidified. not just as a killer, but as a man who brought order to chaos. Someone who understood that in the mafia, the true power wasn't just in fear, it was in management. He wore dark suits, drove a black Lincoln Continental, never flashy, always deliberate. At meetings, he didn't interrupt, he waited, and when he spoke, people leaned in. He had mastered what most gangsters failed to understand. That silence spoke louder than bravado. That stability was a weapon, and that reputation, once built, didn't need to be defended, it needed to be curated. Every handshake, every nod, every contract, signed or broken, it all added bricks to the empire he was quietly constructing. And yet he never stopped watching, never stopped calculating, because in this world, peace wasn't peace, it was just the quiet between betrayals. It was a Tuesday morning, late autumn of 1978, when Sammy Gravano first stood face-to-face with Paul Castellano. The meeting took place inside a marble-floored foyer on Tot Hill, Staten Island, Castellano's fortress of glass and stone, where white-gloved valets whispered instructions and guards watched from tinted windows. The house was a statement, not just of wealth, but of distance. It stood apart, physically, symbolically from the streets where men bled for names they weren't allowed to say aloud inside. The light was cold and quiet. The air carried no scent of garlic or tobacco, only polish, paper, and power. Castellano entered the room like a man who had never needed to run. He wore slippers, a robe over tailored pants. His glasses caught the morning sun. Sammy didn't like him. From the start, Gravano saw Castellano not as a boss, but as a banker. The kind of man who ran a criminal empire with ledgers instead of loyalty. Castellano spoke of percentages, futures, margins. He frowned at street violence, disdained heroin, and preferred accountants to enforcers. He dined with judges and spoke of diplomacy as if the mafia were just another Fortune 500 firm. To a man like Gravano, raised on silence, blood, and survival, this was something worse than arrogance. It was vulnerability. And yet, Castellano was boss. The commission had blessed it. Sammy played along. He nodded when appropriate. He took contracts. He managed unions, but inside, he cataloged every moment the man above him blinked at truth. Castellano didn't understand the street anymore. He lived above it, physically, emotionally, politically, and beneath him the foundation had begun to shift. That foundation was Neil Delacroix. If Castellano was the crown, Delacroix was the sword, the underboss, the man who kept the old code alive while the empire soft above him. Sammy respected Neil deeply, not just for his power, but for his presence. Delacroix had the face of a man who'd buried too many friends to keep track, lines carved by secrets, eyes that had long since stopped blinking at death. He operated out of the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, a dark, dusty room with bad coffee and perfect silence. It was there, not in the marble halls of Tot Hill, that Gravano felt the mafia's true pulse. Delacroix never spoke more than necessary. He didn't threaten, he didn't flatter, he simply expected, and Sammy delivered. Construction rackets, no-show jobs, cement scams running from the Bronx to Coney Island. He grew rich, fast, but more importantly, he grew known, not just for his hands, but for his head. Quiet, reliable, loyal Neil noticed. So did another man. John Gotti entered Sammy's orbit the way lightning enters a field, bright, hot, and impossible to ignore. You heard him before you saw him, loud, laughing, alive in a way most gangsters weren't. He dressed like a movie star and walked like a street fighter. Silver hair, silk ties, and a stare that dared you to look away. They first met at a wedding, a cousin of someone, 100 guests, all pretending they weren't killers. Gotti sat across the table from Gravano. cracking jokes about Castellano's robe and the roast chicken. Sammy didn't laugh, he just watched, and Gotti noticed. "Guy like you," he said, pouring wine. "I bet you don't blink when it counts." Gravano didn't respond. Gotti grinned. "That's good, that's real good. It was the beginning of something that neither man could name yet, a quiet calculation. Gotti was no fool beneath the laughter and flash. He was patient, methodical, and ambitious. He came from the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, an outpost of muscle and loyalty. He ran hijackings, gambling, loans. His crew was young, loyal, and hungry. Gravano watched him rise, watched the way people leaned toward him, even when Castellano was in the room, watched the way whispers followed his steps, and how quickly they stopped when he turned. Something was shifting, and Sammy knew it. The Mafia in the late 1970s was at a crossroads. The Commission, the ruling council of bosses, still held power, but it no longer commanded fear. FBI indictments were rising, surveillance was constant. And inside the five families, the divide between the street and the suit was growing wide. Castellano represented the suit corporate, cautious, insulated. Gotti represented the street volatile, unfiltered, alive, and Delacroce stood in the middle, torn between loyalty to a boss he didn't fully believe in and a soldier whose fire he couldn't deny. Sammy saw the whole board, and like any good player, he stayed quiet until the right piece moved. In 1980, he began spending more time with Gotti's crew, not as a defection, but as a reconnaissance. He attended club meetings, drank with Gotti's men, watched how they operated. They weren't polished, but they were efficient. Gotti didn't micromanage. He empowered. His men feared him, yes, but they also adored him. That was rare and dangerous. Sammy wasn't naive. He knew what was coming, even if no one said it. Aloud, Gotti was going to make a move, but moves in the Mafia weren't made with noise. They were made with patience. Sammy kept his hands clean, paid tribute, answered Ciolano's calls, but his heart was shifting slowly, inexorably toward the streets he never truly left. In conversations with Delacroce, he said little, but Neil could see it. The underboss had no illusions about Castellano's growing distance, nor about Gotti's rising momentum. One day, outside the Ravenite, Delacroce pulled Sammy aside. "I know what you're thinking," he said. Sammy didn't answer. Neil looked at him hard. "Just make sure when it starts you finish it." It wasn't permission, it was prophecy. By 1983, the pressure was suffocating. Castellano had distanced himself further enraged by drug involvement in the family, imposing new rules, punishing Gotti's men. He was losing the room, losing the street, and Gotti was waiting, not for the chance, for the justification. When Delacroce died in December 1985, the balance snapped. Castellano bypassed Gotti, named a successor without consulting the street crews. It was more than an insult. It was a declaration. Sammy felt it, so did Gotti, so did every man who'd ever buried someone for this thing of ours. Something ancient had been broken, and what followed would not be quiet, but that reckoning would come later. For now, in the shadow of the Commission, a new pact was forming, not in marble mansions, but in smoke-filled back rooms and whispered car rides, between Gravano and Gotti, between blood and fire. And the Mafia would never be the same again. The snow fell quiet and heavy on East 46th Street, drifting down like ash from a slow-burning fire. It was December 16th, 1985, just after 5 in the evening, and New York's steel and glass canyons pulsed with their usual rhythm. Yellow cabs honked, steam billowed from manholes, and on the corner of 3rd Avenue, in front of a steakhouse lit in warm amber, 2 men waited in silence beneath their coats. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were there for a moment. The city would never forget Sammy Gravano wasn't on the sidewalk that day. He was in a car nearby one of the lookouts, watching, thinking. The engine was running. The heater ticked faintly in his lap. A pistol sat covered beneath a folded newspaper. He didn't plan to use it, not unless everything fell apart. But in this business, contingency wasn't caution, it was survival. Across the street, Sparks' Steakhouse bustled with its usual dinner. Rush businessmen, tourists, waiters in white shirts carrying trays of martinis and bone-in ribeyes. No one saw it coming. At exactly 5:26 p.m., Paul Castellano stepped out of his Lincoln. He wore a gray overcoat, high-collared. His driver, Thomas Bilotti, moved around to open the door. They said nothing, but they wouldn't need to again. The gunmen emerged like shadows. 4 of them, 2 on each side. They didn't run, they didn't yell. They simply walked up and opened fire 16 rounds, center mass. Castellano dropped before his bodyguard could blink. Blood sprayed against the snow, warm red on cold white. Bilotti reached for his gun, but he was already falling. It took less than 10 seconds. A coup, not in shadows, but in the open, under Christmas lights and falling snow, and Sammy watched it unfold. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't breathe for a moment. He just watched. This wasn't some back alley job. This wasn't a message in whispers. This was war in daylight, on a Manhattan sidewalk, in front of tourists in Wall Street suits. It was unthinkable, unforgivable, unapproved. But it was done. Gravano adjusted his coat collar, started the car, and pulled away. Not fast, just enough to fade into traffic like any other commuter heading toward the Midtown Tunnel. In the mirror, the steakhouse was already surrounded, sirens approaching. Pedestrians scattering, someone screaming. Castellano was gone, and John Gotti had just become the most powerful gangster in America. The days that followed moved like molasses, slow, dense, and irreversible. The commission, the ruling council of the 5 families, was livid. The hit had not been sanctioned. Castellano was boss. Killing a boss without permission wasn't just reckless, it was sacrilege. But Gotti didn't apologize. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He moved into the late Paul's seat like he'd been warming it all along, inside the Gambino family. The message was clear. The crown had changed heads, and anyone who hesitated would be next. And the man standing closest to Gotti, the one he trusted most now, was Salvatore Gravano. Sammy didn't pull the trigger that night, but he made it possible. He coordinated, he cleared paths, he assigned lookouts, he arranged exits. He read the street, the timing, the people, and Gotti saw it all. The formal ceremony came weeks later indoors, quiet, symbolic, but the real moment had already happened. Not in any ritual, but in the look between 2 men sitting in the Ravenite Social Club one evening in early January. Smoke curled between them. "Underboss," Gotti said. He didn't smile. Sammy nodded once. He didn't speak. No toast, no applause, just an understanding. Gravano had risen from a kid on the stoop in Bensonhurst to number 2 in the most powerful crime family in America, and it had all hinged on a single moment outside a steakhouse. But behind the celebration, behind the newfound influence, was a shadow that would never fully leave, the kind of shadow that follows every public murder, especially one that rewrites the structure of the mafia. Sammy knew it, felt it in the way other bosses spoke to him now, with respect, yes, but also calculation. The commission didn't forget. They couldn't punish Gotti outright, not yet. His popularity, his reach, his audacity, it was too hot to touch. But resentment lingered. Castellano may have ruled with a velvet fist, but he was a commission man, old school, a believer in protocol. His murder wasn't just the fall of a boss, it was the breaking of a tradition, and Gravano had helped break it. Still, he didn't regret it, not in the quiet of his own mind, not in the way things worked. Castellano had been disconnected, slow, soft. He had tried to run a family like a stock portfolio. The street didn't trust him. The crews didn't fear him. And the moment Delacroce died, the balance tipped. Sammy saw the future in Gotti loud. Fearless, charismatic, dangerous, it wasn't loyalty that drew him close. It was instinct. An instinct had kept him alive this long. Now, as underboss, Gravano's responsibilities expanded overnight. He controlled entire rackets' construction. Scams worth millions, trucking unions that could shut down entire ports, loan-sharking routes stretching from Queens to Long Island. He sat at tables where real estate developers begged for building permits and city contractors paid premiums just to stay on the schedule. And still he enforced. If someone crossed a line, Gravano handled it. Quiet, permanent. He was the executive and the executioner, but the higher he climbed, the colder the air became with Castellano. The lines had been rigid boss, underboss, capo, soldier with Gotti. Everything was fluid, flexible, alive, and always under surveillance. The FBI had been watching the mafia for years, but now, with a boss as public as Gotti, a man who wore $1,000 suits to trial and grinned for the cameras, the heat had tripled. Gravano noticed it in the silence after meetings, in the cars parked a block too close, in the faces he saw twice in the same week, but never recognized. There were eyes on them now, not just from rival families, but from the government, from wiretaps, from walls that suddenly echoed when no one was speaking. The price of power was paranoia, and business was booming. Still, the streets respected him. Where Gotti was showtime, Sammy was substance. He didn't brag. He didn't bluff. He delivered. He was fair when it counted, merciless when it didn't. People trusted him. They feared him. And for a while, that was enough. But that moment in front of Sparks' Steakhouse, that blood on the sidewalk, that line crossed without permission, it was a bell that couldn't be unrung. And somewhere deep inside Gravano, he knew that the day they took Castellano was the day they started the clock. Not on their rise, but on their reckoning. It was never just about the money. Not for Sammy. Not in the beginning. Money came fast in the mid-1980s, especially when you ran one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. But for Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, power was built on something quieter: respect, predictability, fear when necessary, but never chaos. And yet, every time he looked across the table at John Gotti's slick suit, broad grin, flashing rings, he saw chaos beginning to smile back. These were the golden years of the Gambino crime. Family at their peak, they touched everything. City contracts, private unions, trucking lines, high-rises, scaffolding, bids, cement. The infrastructure of New York pulsed with Gambino fingerprints, and Gravano's signature sat invisibly beneath. Most of it, Sammy didn't just run jobs. He engineered systems, entire networks of rigged bids, and controlled developers who lined up with folded envelopes and whispered tributes. He knew which inspector had a mortgage payment due, which foreman liked betting horses, which city clerk owed a favor. Money didn't move without his nod, and money moved constantly. From 1986 to 1989, Gravano's operations generated millions. Estimates stretched into the hundreds. His companies, like Atlas Concrete and Woodside Construction, won government contracts and private projects alike, officially legitimate, functionally criminal. But this wasn't just muscle anymore. It was architecture. Sammy held it all together. Gotti, meanwhile, held the spotlight. The contrast between them had grown sharper with each passing month. Where Sammy stayed in the shadows, conducting meetings, in dim restaurants or basements behind the storefronts, Gotti strolled down Mulberry Street like he was running for office. He waved at reporters outside the Ravenite Social Club, wore $1,000 ties to court hearings, gave statements to the press with a grin and a shrug. They called him the dapper Doan, and for a time America was fascinated. To the outside world, Gotti was charisma, style, untouchable cool. But to Sammy, his showmanship had begun to rot the foundation. He saw it first in the meetings. What used to be private became performative, where once 5 trusted men would gather behind closed doors. Now 10 or 15 would sit, posturing, smiling, nodding. For the boss, Gotti loved it. He thrived on the noise, the pageantry, the performance. Sammy endured it because someone had to keep the machine running while the boss played king. He kept his crew lean. He kept records in his head. He never repeated a word twice. He watched who arrived early and who glanced too often at the walls, who smoked too quickly, and who forgot the names of the dead. He saw everything, and slowly the weight of it began to build. The FBI was getting closer. Sammy could feel it before he heard it. Cars parked just a little too long, strangers sitting. In diners reading newspapers they never turned, faces that showed up on 2 different blocks 3 days apart. The pattern recognition that had once kept him alive now whispered that the game had changed. Then came the indictments. Men from the P. Colombo family, the Lucchese's, even their own Gambino associates, picked up quietly, turned, flipped, silenced. The feds were tightening the net, not around the organization, but around its personalities, its cracks, its pride, and Gotti was loud. Too loud, inside the Ravenite. Social club, the old ways were dying. Meetings once reserved for whispers now occurred under flickering lights, with half the neighborhood invited to listen. Everyone wanted to be seen with Gotti. Few wanted to die with him. Sammy didn't complain, but he noticed one day, after a meeting on a zoning scam involving a Queens development, Gravano approached Gotti privately. "We can't keep doing it this way," he said, low and even. Gotti leaned back, exhaled smoke. "We've got it under control." Sammy didn't answer, because he knew they didn't. The empire still stood, but it shook. They controlled union locals, Local 282, Local 230, through no-show jobs and bid rigging. Sammy turned concrete into gold, but the process took work, diplomacy, respect. Sammy was ruthless, but never sloppy. He ran his crew like a corporation. Punishments came only when necessary. He believed in fairness. He'd give a man a second chance, sometimes even a third. But betrayals weren't forgiven. Ever he buried those himself. By this point his legend had grown. The Bull, a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene, but who handled business with finality. He didn't brag about the lives he'd taken, but he didn't deny them either. When a problem arose, a late payment, a disrespect, a debt unpaid, he'd meet the man, quietly, usually just once. Sometimes the man left with a new deal. Sometimes he didn't leave at all, but the golden years came at a cost. Sammy's life no longer belonged to him. Every hour was spoken for. Meetings, calls, drop-ins, sit-downs. Everyone needed a favor. A signature, a problem solved. Money piled up faster than he could spend it. His businesses ran like clockwork, but the hours inside his own house slowed to nothing. Deborah, his wife, had learned not to ask questions. Karen, his daughter, still looked at him like a father, but Sammy knew the truth. He was fading from them, inch by inch, because the empire had grown too big, too loud, too visible. In 1987, Sammy was arrested briefly on racketeering charges. Nothing stuck. He walked in 1988. He testified in a civil suit involving a labor dispute, cool, calm, evasive. In 1989, the Ravenite Social Club was bugged by the FBI. No one knew yet, but the wire was live, and the clock had started ticking. Inside, the Gambino family still ran. The city, from building sites to loan sharks, from backroom casinos to unions, their power was undeniable. Millions flowed upward. Respect trickled downward. But trust? Trust had begun to leak, and Sammy felt it in the pauses between conversations, in the changed tone of Gotti's voice when he spoke of blame, and the way everyone looked at each other now quickly. And then away, these were still the golden years, but the gold was wearing thin, and somewhere, just beyond the reach of their empire, the future was listening. Quietly, carefully, through a wire, it was the sound of betrayal. Not a bullet, not a slap, just a voice low, confident, and laughing. The tape began with static. Then the door at the Ravenite Social Club creaked open, followed by the clinking of glasses, the hush of shifting coats, and the familiar swagger of John Gotti settling into his corner seat. Outside, Mulberry Street glowed with Christmas lights, but inside, history was cracking beneath the weight of a few careless words. The FBI had been trying to bug the Gambinos. For years, they had tapped phones, trailed cars, planted eyes in diners and hallways. Nothing stuck. Until 1989, when they finally got inside the Ravenites' walls. Not just inside the main room, but into the back Gotti's sanctum. They bugged the ceiling vent, crude, risky, brilliant, and what they heard changed everything. The voice was unmistakable. I told the kid not to do it. That was his call. It was Gotti, and the kid was Sammy Gravano. Another voice chimed in, Frank Locascio. Consigliere, loyal to Gotti to the bone. He went too far, John, and now we all pay. Gotti didn't hesitate. Yeah, he's a greedy bastard. He's bringing heat. The words landed like a blade in the dark. Sammy, the underboss, Sammy, who had personally carried out 19 murders for the family, Sammy, who had brokered million-dollar rackets, held the street together, shielded Gotti from messy logistics, and now he was being laid bare on tape. As the fall guy, as the mistake, the agents hit gold. Not because Gotti was confessing to murder, but because he was revealing the fracture, the unraveling of Cosa Nostra from the inside. Sammy wasn't just another name on a chart. He was the machine behind the empire. And now, the machine was being dismantled by the man it had served. The FBI didn't celebrate aloud. They didn't need to. They had the only thing more powerful than an informant. They had a voice, and in the mafia, silence was sacred. But voices? They could burn everything down. When Sammy heard the tape for the first time, it was late, a sterile federal room. No windows, the table was cheap metal, cold beneath his forearms. An agent pressed play. And there it was, his name, his decisions, his reputation, all dismantled in 25 seconds by the man he'd killed for. Sammy didn't move, didn't blink, but something inside him shifted. It wasn't rage, it was something quieter, recognition. For years he'd known Gotti was different. Not old school, not careful. A man who thought charm could replace discipline, who thought respect came with flash and silk. Sammy had tolerated. It respected it, even, because Gotti, for all his noise, had vision. He had pulled off the Castellano hit when no one else dared. He had united crews that once would have slit each other's throats. But beneath it all, Gotti was a performer, and now the performance was over. The indictment came in December of 1990. Charges: racketeering, murder, obstruction of justice. Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio all named. The press went wild. Dapper Doan indicted again. Mob kingpin faces life. Sammy the Bull in custody. The headlines were electric, but for Sammy it was quieter than that. He sat in his cell and thought not about the trial, but about the voice on the tape. The smirk behind it, the casualness of it all. There were rules, even among killers. Rules about loyalty, about honor. You didn't talk about your own men. Not like that. You didn't survive by throwing dirt on your foundation. And now Gotti had done just that. To the world he was still the boss. Still grinning. still invincible, but to Sammy, he was already dead. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the three men waited. Days blurred into nights. Meetings with lawyers, rumors, eavesdropping, paranoia. They were still a crew technically, but something had broken, not just in Sammy and the rhythm between them, in the way Gotti gave orders with less confidence, in the way Locascio avoided Sammy's eyes. They still sat at the same table, but they weren't at the same table, not anymore. Sammy replayed the tape in his mind over and over. He's greedy, he's reckless. He did that on his own. He had always known Gotti would protect himself first, but this wasn't just self-preservation. It was betrayal with a smile, and for the first time in his life, Sammy began to consider something that once would have seemed impossible. Speaking not to his lawyer, not to his crew, to the government, to the enemy. The idea started as a flicker, then grew, not out of fear, but out of finality. Sammy had never been afraid of prison. He'd been afraid of being made a fool, of dying for a man who wouldn't die for him, and now there were only two paths left, loyalty or survival. He weighed them. One came with silence, the other with a voice. In January of 1991, prosecutors made their first quiet offer. Testify. Flip. Tell us how it worked. Tell us where the money went. Tell us who pulled which trigger. And why Sammy didn't answer. Not yet. He still needed one more push. He got it. A second tape. More laughter. More blame. Another moment where Gotti pressed for answers. Pointed his finger at the one man who had never failed him. The one man who had done everything. Sammy closed his eyes in that fluorescent-lit room. He thought about Bensonhurst, the stoop, the rappers, the first stolen Buick, the first punch, the first kill. He thought about Woodside Construction, the envelopes, the bribes, the silent boardrooms. He thought about Sparks Steakhouse, the snow, the blood, the whisper of a car engine idling in the cold. He thought about his wife, his daughter, the years gone, the walls closing. And then he opened his eyes and said the words that would change everything. I'll talk. The room was small, windowless, the kind of space that felt built to hold silence. Its walls were off-white, stained faintly with years of smoke and secrets. The light above hummed, steady and impersonal. In the corner, a coffee machine burbled without purpose. And at the center of it all sat a man in a government-issued sweatshirt, a cup of water on the table, and a tape recorder glowing red. It was 1991. Salvatore Gravano was 46 years old, and he was about to destroy the very world that had built him. The decision to flip had not come in an instant. It wasn't rage or revenge or desperation. It was calculation, survival, a cold, careful reappraisal of loyalty in the face of betrayal. Gotti had tried to frame him, had mocked him on tape, had laid the groundwork for Sammy to be the fall guy. So Sammy did what he'd always done. He read the landscape, adjusted, moved. Only this time the move was seismic. He sat across from two federal agents. No names were exchanged. Not really, just initials, case files, trial dates. They offered him coffee. He declined, then without ceremony, without hesitation. Gravano leaned forward and began to talk. His voice was steady, measured, clear. The first thing he said was a name, then a date, then another name. A street corner, a bullet, a body. The agents nodded. The tape turned. He continued. It wasn't just the murders. It was the structure, the blueprint. How the Gambino family moved money from construction projects in Manhattan to union bribes in Queens. How no-show jobs were filled by dead men. How a silent nod across a restaurant could greenlight a killing. Sammy outlined it all, not as if remembering, but as if reciting, each detail delivered without inflection. A businessman walking through an audit. There was no blood in his words, but there was weight. He spoke of men who had trusted him, shared wine with him, buried bodies beside him. He told the agents about Frank Fiala blown apart outside the Plaza Suite nightclub in 1982, about Louis de Bono killed in a parking garage after defying Gotti's orders, about the meetings that followed, the nods, the silence, the rules of the thing 19 murders confirmed and more, implied one agent older, thinning hair, a wedding ring polished flat by habit paused between tapes and asked the question everyone wanted to ask. Do you feel anything when you talk about them? Gravano didn't look up. I remember all of them, he said. That was all. In those weeks, hours, bleeding into hours, he gave them everything. The structure of the commission, the territories, the personalities, the real estate fronts, the casinos, the cocaine. He explained how a construction bid was manipulated with 5 phone calls, how a labor dispute could be settled with one threat and a new Cadillac, how judges could be leaned on, how juries could be influenced, he told them, how the mafia really worked, not the movies, not the myths, the truth, cold, precise, predictable. By the second week, the agents no longer interrupted, they just listened. Tape after tape. Gravano sat in the same position, hands folded, back straight, eyes fixed on the taped deck as if it were a confessional booth. There was no remorse, but there was no pleasure. Either just process. In the evenings he would return to his protective suite. Federal custody, a small bed, a television, meals brought on trays. He never asked for visitors, rarely turned the TV on. He'd sit, sometimes for hours, staring at the wall, not in regret, not in guilt, in memory. He was not trying to justify himself. He wasn't trying to erase what he had done. He was doing what he had always done, surviving the agents to their credit. Kept their distance. They didn't joke with him. They didn't scold. They knew what they were witnessing wasn't just testimony. It was a purge, a systematic dismantling of one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates in American history. From the inside, by one of its architects, when word leaked that Sammy Gravano had flipped, the underworld froze. It wasn't just shocking, it was sacrilegious. Made men didn't talk. Underbosses never talked. Sammy the Bull, loyal, lethal. Feared had crossed the line none dared cross. Inside prison walls, his name became a whisper. Some called him a traitor, others called him a genius. Some said he'd broken Omerta, others said Omerta had already broken him, but all agreed on one thing. Nothing would be the same after Gravano back in the room. The tapes stacked higher. Transcripts ran thousands of pages. He diagrammed the structure of the family like a surgeon drawing anatomy. He identified capos, associates, soldiers, named names, corrected agent assumptions, explained internal codes and gestures that had puzzled investigators for years. Sometimes, in the quiet after a tape ended, he would exhale slowly and murmur something under his breath. One time the agent caught it. Everything ends, Sammy had said. Even this thing. By the end of his depositions, the FBI had what they needed. Not just to take down John Gotti, but to shake the foundation of organized crime in New York. Sammy Gravano, once a boy on the stoop in Bensonhurst, once the silent shadow behind the dapper Doan, once the architect of fear, had flipped the board and walked away from the table. They called it the trial of the century, but for Sammy Gravano, it was something colder, a reckoning, a slow, public autopsy of everything he'd once believed sacred. The courtroom wasn't a battlefield. It was a stage-polished wood, heavy drapes, fluorescent light. The Southern District of New York, 1992. The marble walls seemed to absorb the weight of history as it unfolded. Inside, Gravano sat at the witness stand, his posture composed, hands folded neatly in front of him, eyes locked forward. Across from him sat John Gotti, gray pinstripe, white pocket square, hair slicked like silver wire, the man who had once laughed across long tables with him, the man who had worn power like it was stitched into his cuffs. Now, reduced to a still figure behind the defense table, expression unreadable, jaw set like concrete, Sammy didn't flinch, didn't stutter, didn't blink. His testimony came like a tide, slow, relentless, detailed. He spoke of 19 murders, meetings, envelopes, sit-downs at the Ravenite Social Club. He described the hierarchy of the Gambino family, the extortion of construction companies, the union scams, the no-show jobs. He outlined exactly how Gotti had ordered Louis de Bono's killing in a parking garage, how Paul Castellano's assassination had unfolded step by step outside Sparks' steakhouse. Every sentence was another crack in the myth. The press couldn't look away. Outside, reporters formed a wall. Flashbulbs sparked like gunfire. Headlines burned across the nation. The bull turns on the boss. Sammy Gravano testifies Cosa Nostra exposed. John Gotti faces his day of judgment. For the public, it was spectacle. For the government, it was vindication. But for the mafia, it was blasphemy. The code of silence omerta had been broken by one of their own. Inside the courtroom, Gravano's voice never wavered. He explained how Gotti had basked in media attention after every acquittal, how he flaunted the justice system, laughed at the jurors, soaked up the spotlight. But in private, Sammy said, the cracks were always there. He blamed me. Gravano told the court, calm as scripture. He said I was the reason for the indictments, the reason we had heat. He paused, looked up, met the jury's eyes. I took orders. I followed them, every single one. But when things went bad, he wanted someone to burn, and that was me. The prosecutors leaned in. The defense bristled. Gotti never spoke, but his silence spoke louder than any cross-examination could. Sammy went on. He told the court how money flowed through the family cash, from unions, siphoned from developers, laundered through construction companies and social clubs. He named names, told stories, explained protocols only whispered about in corners of darkened rooms. He took a world built on secrecy and laid it bare. Brick by brick, Gotti's defense team tried to spin it. They painted Gravano as a liar, a killer, a man trying to save himself by dragging down the throne. They called him a snake in a silk suit, said he was rewriting history to suit a deal. But the jury didn't see a desperate man. They saw precision, they saw conviction, they saw betrayal, but also clarity. The trial lasted nearly 2 months, and on April 2nd, 1992, the verdict was delivered. John Gotti guilty on all counts: murder, racketeering, obstruction, loan sharking, tax evasion, life without parole. The dapper Doan was now the lifer Doan. He blinked slowly as the sentence was read. No outburst, no visible crack in composure. But the myth had ended not in a gunfight, not in exile, but in federal court, with microphones catching every beat of silence. Outside, the mafia reeled old bosses called Gravano poison, a disease that had infected the bloodstream of La Cosa Nostra. He wasn't just a rat, he was the end of an era. Carmen Persico, Vincent Gigante, Anthony Casso, men who had ruled corners of New York with violence and fear, saw the writing on the wall. If he could flip, anyone could. If he could speak, nothing was sacred. But Gravano didn't care. He didn't read the headlines, didn't answer the calls. He'd made peace with his choice long before the jury returned. In a quiet federal safe house, days after the verdict, he sat with his handlers and said, I did what I had to. There was no triumph in his voice, no regret either, only resolve. The public debated his motives. Was he a hero who brought down a dangerous criminal, or a traitor who sold his soul to dodge a cell? In truth, he was neither, or maybe both, a killer who chose truth over loyalty, a man who turned on the very thing that had given him power, protection, and purpose. Because the rules had changed, because loyalty, once his highest law, had been turned against him because the man at the top had made him disposable, and Gravano refused to die for anyone else's myth. The trial didn't just end a man, it ended a system. With one verdict, the curtain was pulled back on Cosa Nostra. Rituals, its codes, its hierarchy, the underworld was no longer untouchable. It was exposed, vulnerable, human, and Gravano calm, composed. Cold had done it with nothing but a voice. In later interviews, Sammy was asked if he feared retribution. He said no, he'd lived with death behind every door. He'd killed for the family, now he had killed the family, not with a gun, but with memory, with testimony, with truth. The mafia would go on, but it would never be the same, and neither would he. The desert had no memory. At least, that's what they told him. Dry earth, wide sky, wind that moved without direction. Arizona was the kind of place where people went to be forgotten, either by others or by themselves. It was 1994. Sammy Gravano was no longer Sammy Gravano. Not officially. He was now a man with a new name, a new face, a new past, but the same shadows. He arrived under federal escort papers, signed, hair trimmed, a fresh alias printed in ink, still drying. No headlines, no handshakes, just a silent car ride through dust and cactus into a quiet suburb. Outside Phoenix, he was given a small house, a basic car, a federal stipend to get on his feet, a second life. And yet, everything felt too quiet. The mornings were long, too much light, the coffee too weak. Sammy would wake up before dawn, sit on the edge of the bed, and stare at the carpet. In New York, his mornings used to begin with tension, a call, a knock, a name that needed handling. Now there was nothing, no crews, no tributes, no silent nods, just a lawn to mow, a driveway to sweep. He tried to adjust, tried to disappear. He opened a small business, a pool cleaning company, legitimate, modest, a few routes, a few employees, clients who didn't know or pretended not to know who he used to be. He wore wraparound sunglasses, kept his head down, drove a pickup. He smiled politely, charged fairly. It was the first honest money he'd made in 40 years. He tried to be a father again. Karen, his daughter, had stood by him through everything. Through courtrooms, indictments, rumors in Arizona. She started. Over two opened a salon, built a new circle. Sometimes they'd have dinner together, trying to laugh, to make it all seem normal. But something always hung in the air, something unspoken. Corinne saw it in his posture, the way he scanned every restaurant before sitting down, the way he watched. Passing cars for too long, the way his right hand always hovered near his belt. Even when he wasn't carrying, the mafia had been carved into his muscle memory. And some habits don't forget. The press found him first. A local reporter got a tip Sammy the Bull is in Scottsdale. Then came the articles, then the whispers, then the half-glances in grocery store aisles, people who smiled too wide, people who left the table when he sat down, people who stared just a little too long. The government moved him. Different street, different name again, but the feeling remained, not fear, limbo. He wasn't a gangster anymore, but he wasn't a citizen either. He was something in between, a ghost with skin, a man with memories too loud for silence. He tried hobbies, golf, painting, desert hikes. None of it stuck. His mind wandered to Bensonhurst, to Gotti's laugh, to Frank Fiala's body on the concrete, to the red snow outside Sparks, to the tape recorder glowing red in that cold room, to everything he'd done. He didn't cry, he didn't feel sorry, but he felt, and that was worse. Sometimes, late at night, he'd step outside and smoke in the driveway. He'd look at the stars and wonder if anyone from the old world was still alive, if anyone still spoke his name in whispers, if someone somewhere had been sent to find him. He knew the answer, of course they had, but no one came, because even in the mafia, There are some names you don't touch, and Sammy Gravano had become radioactive still. The silence pressed in, the stillness turned to wait. Without an enemy, without a target, without a crew, he didn't know what to be. He had lived a life of motion, of decisions, of sharp instincts and tighter schedules. Witness protection was a hallway with no doors, a life with no contours. He had survived. But survival without purpose was just waiting, and Sammy didn't wait well. By 1996, the pool business was steady. The media had quieted. The FBI had mostly pulled back. He'd done everything right, but still, the restlessness, that feeling in his chest that something had gone stale, that the world had shifted too far without him. He watched the news and saw younger crews making noise. Street gangs with cell phones and no codes. He read about arrest skids, ratting out bosses without flinching. No omerta, no tradition. The world he knew was gone. The streets didn't speak his language anymore, and yet something in him still whispered, "Move." So in 1997, he began making calls, quiet ones, old contacts, not from New York, from elsewhere. Arizona had its own corners, its own players, meth labs in Mesa, ecstasy routes out of Nevada, clubs, lounges, young men who didn't know his full history, but knew enough to keep their mouths shut. Sammy never said he was back, but he started showing up, giving advice, fixing problems, and slowly, very slowly, the quiet gave way to noise again. But that's another story, because in these years, between the courtroom and the comeback, Sammy Gravano lived like a man split in two, alive but undefined, freed from the world that made him, but still haunted by the silence that followed. In the end, it wasn't honor or revenge or even survival that brought Sammy Gravano back to crime. It was restlessness, that itch beneath the skin, the hum of control, of movement, of danger absent too long. He had lived as a ghost for nearly a decade. New name, new town, a cleaned-up version of himself who ran a pool cleaning business under Arizona's sun. For a while, he played the role. Well, the family man, the retired tough guy. But silence, for men like him, wasn't peace. It was rot. And by the late 1990s, Gravano began to move again. Not with bullets, this time with pills. The world had changed while he'd been gone. Gone were the old crews and codes. The street corners were now neon-lit raves and warehouse parties in Phoenix and Scottsdale. Kids danced under black light until dawn, chasing highs with names like Red Rocket and Blue Buddha. The drug of choice was no longer heroin or cocaine. It was ecstasy, MDMA, cheap, potent, explosive, and profit. Gravano didn't stumble into it. He chose it, and he didn't work alone. He brought in his son. Gerard Gravano had grown up in the long, dark shadow of the Gambino name. He'd lived through the trials, the headlines, the whispers in classrooms. Now in his 20s, Gerard moved through clubs and backrooms like a native. He knew the DJs, the promoters, the kids with backpacks, full of pills and pockets full of illusions, and Sammy watched. He saw the potential, not in the drugs. In the structure, the business was sloppy, filled with amateurs, corner cutters, teenagers pretending to be kingpins. There were no rules, no organization, just chaos. Gravano understood what that meant. Opportunity. He began pulling the strings, not in the open, but from behind doors. He used aliases, burner phones, shell companies. He built a supply chain from California to Arizona, from labs in L.A. to party scenes in Tempe. They moved thousands of pills a week, color-coded, stamped with logos, hidden in speaker boxes, car doors, gym bags. He took the mess of the ecstasy trade and imposed order, structure, power, again. But this wasn't the mafia. There were no rituals, no loyalties, no omerta, just kids chasing dopamine and quick money, associates who crumbled under pressure. runners who bragged to girlfriends, partners who didn't know how to keep their mouths shut. The empire grew fast, too fast, and the heat came with it. The D had been tracking the pills for months. Agents followed the trail from Phoenix nightclubs to distribution in Las Vegas and Albuquerque. Anonymous tips, undercover buys, phone taps, surveillance vans. They didn't know, at first, who sat at the top. The names were fake, the meetings were scattered, but the scale was too big, too coordinated. And then someone talked. It always starts with one. In early 2000, a federal task force moved in, simultaneous raids across Arizona, storage units, apartments, warehouses, boxes of pills, guns, ledgers, and finally Sammy. He was arrested without fanfare, no violence, no standoff, just a quiet ride in the back of a D car, hands cuffed, eyes fixed out the window. He didn't ask questions. He knew what was coming. The indictment read like a blueprint. Multiple counts of narcotics trafficking, money laundering, criminal conspiracy. Involvement in a drug ring distributing over 500,000 pills. His son was charged too. Gerard, 24, had been running logistics, moving product, handling money. His fingerprints were everywhere. The press exploded. Sammy the Bull back behind. Bars, from mafia underboss to drug kingpin, ecstasy empire tied to notorious turncoat. For law enforcement, it was vindication. For the underworld, it was irony. And for Sammy, it was inevitable. In court, he stood without expression. No suits, no ties, just the standard inmate jumpsuit, loose at the shoulders, his hair grayer now, his face sharper, years of silence and heat carved into his posture. He didn't speak at length, he didn't beg. He took a plea deal guilty on all counts. In 2002, the sentence was handed down, 20 years in federal prison. Some called it greed, others called it ego. But the truth was simpler. Some men are not built for stillness. Sammy had survived betrayals, indictments, life inside the mafia, and life outside it. But the hardest thing, the one thing he could never endure, was irrelevance. In Arizona, with a lawn and a truck and no one to fear him, he had faded. So he created something new, something he could control, even if it wasn't honorable, even if it was doomed. Because control, for Gravano, was always the point. Inside Florence Correctional Center, the lights buzzed soft against concrete walls. The food was bland, the hours long, but Sammy adjusted. Quickly, he read, he exercised, he spoke little. He never joined a gang. He didn't need to. His name still echoed through every corridor, and his past walked beside him like a second shadow. The years passed slowly. His children visited when they could. His name showed up in articles, documentaries, books, but he remained inside, removed from the world he once ruled, and the world he'd tried to re-enter. Twice he had built empires, twice. They had crumbled. The third time there would be no rebuilding. He was eligible for release in 2017, but even long before then, long before parole hearings and media coverage, Gravano had already arrived at the one truth that all men like him eventually face. Power fades, names fade, even legends lose their grip, but the hunger? That stays. They took him in without a word. No headlines this time, no cameras, no courtroom full of flashbulbs, no kingpin grinning beneath a silk tie, just a slow shuffle through intake at Florence Correctional Center, his ankles shackled and wrists raw from transport. He was 57 years old. His hair had thinned. His face had hardened into hollows. The strength was still there, but it moved slower, deeper, like something fossilized. Sammy Gravano, once underboss of the Gambino crime family, once the man who turned Omerta into ash, was back behind concrete walls and steel bars. This time he would stay a while. The cell was small, beige, and indifferent. It didn't care who. You had been. Gravano adjusted quickly. He always had. He folded his jumpsuit, swept the floor, did his time like he was pouring concrete, one line at a time. No complaints, no illusions. This was his second empire. Only now the empire was a routine. He'd wake early, sit on the edge of the bed, drink instant coffee with no sugar, then walk the yard alone, slow steps, circling a patch of dirt the sun couldn't change. The guards kept their distance. The younger inmates whispered. They didn't quite know who he was, but they knew enough not to forget. The prison library became his quiet domain. He read slowly philosophy, history, transcripts from old cases, and his own words, dozens of interviews, profiles, court documents. His voice, his name, printed and archived. He read them not out of ego, but out of reflection. Some of it felt like fiction, some of it too real. One day, an inmate handed him a copy of Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi, the book that became Goodfellas. Sammy flipped through the pages in silence. That's not how it was, he muttered. But he kept reading anyway. In the evenings, he wrote. On yellow legal pads, slow and deliberate, like laying bricks, memories, lists, names, reflections. He wasn't writing for anyone else. Not yet. He was writing to organize the past, to wrestle it into something he could hold, a ledger of sins and structure. He wrote about Castellano, about Gotti, about Delacroce and the meetings at the Ravenite. He wrote about the hits clean ones, sloppy ones, necessary ones. He wrote about the courtroom where he gave it all up. He wrote about Karen, about Deborah. He wrote about the day he heard the tapes. And he wrote about silence, the kind that comes not after betrayal, but after purpose has left the room, the world. Outside moved without him. Mob headlines disappeared. The 5 families shrank into shadows. The new bosses didn't last. The code of Omerta had crumbled. Everyone talked now. Kids with sneakers and burner phones and no discipline. The mafia, if you could still call it, that had lost its poetry. No loyalty, no craft, just fragments, one. Night, a younger inmate asked him, "Did you really kill 19 people?" Sammy looked at him. His voice was low. "I stopped counting a long time ago." The kid didn't ask again. The years passed like water dripping on stone. In 2005, Gravano underwent surgery complications from thyroid disease. His health declined. His walks became shorter. His weight dropped. He moved like someone used to carrying more than his body. Other inmates got early release. Some died. Some vanished into witness protection. Sammy remained alive, but in limbo. He heard rumors that Gotti's son had tried to rebuild the family, that others had used his name, Gravano's crew. They called it to sell drugs he never touched. That YouTube was full of kids reenacting his testimony like it was Shakespeare. He laughed once, not because it was funny, but because memory always rewrites itself. The guards respected him, not because they liked him, but because he carried himself like a man with nothing left to prove. No fights, no outbursts, no begging, just discipline, just silence. He missed the street, but not the noise. He missed the structure, but not the suits. What he missed, more than anything, was the meaning, not money, not violence, but the weight of every move mattering. The precision, the calculus, that was gone now. Prison replaced it with routine, predictable, pointless, but safe. Sometimes he'd stand at the window, looking out, past the wire and the fence, and imagine Bensonhurst, the stoops, the voices, the way the city used to breathe like a living thing. And then he'd remember that city didn't exist anymore, and neither did that man by the late 2010s. His name had faded from the newspapers. He was a footnote in documentaries, a cautionary tale in podcasts, a ghost inside someone else's legend. But those who had lived it, those who had known, still remembered. Because Sammy wasn't just a gangster. He was the one who crossed the line and lived. The one who burned the house down from the inside. and then kept walking. He was released in 2017, quietly, without ceremony, but that's not this story. This story ends in the cold stillness of a prison cell, with a man who had once pulled empires together through force and silence, now laying still under fluorescent lights, carving his name into the stone of memory, not feared, not forgotten, just watching. The Arizona sun was still climbing when the gate buzzed open. No press waited outside, no mobsters, no victims' families, just a dusted parking lot, flat and indifferent, and one unmarked sedan idling beneath the shade of a creosote bush. It had been nearly 2 decades. Sammy Gravano stepped out of the Florence Correctional Center with the same posture he had carried into it, shoulders squared, eyes forward, jaw set like granite. But now the weight of age showed in the slowness of his gait, in the slight tremble of his fingers as he buttoned his collar against the morning chill. He had gone in a legend. He came out a relic. There was no welcome home parade, just a small rental house on the outskirts of Phoenix. Single story, beige stucco, gravel lawn, the kind of place that wouldn't draw attention, not from neighbors, not from enemies, and not from history. Inside, the furniture was sparse. A couch, a table, a television with too many remotes. On the kitchen counter sat a black notebook. On its cover, one word in block lettering: content. Sammy had a new plan. The world had changed. The mafia was no longer feared. It was binge-watched, reenacted, pulled apart by podcast hosts and YouTubers dissecting old trials and wiretaps like sacred texts. The young ones didn't know Gravano. They didn't feel his weight, but they would. The voice came first. Gravano launched a podcast hour thing from a nondescript recording room outfitted with foam panels, a single microphone, and an LED ring light that made his wrinkles look deeper, his eyes more hollow. The intro music was sparse, no bravado, no Godfather strings, just his voice, slow, measured, sober. He told stories, not sermons, recollections of murder, betrayal, prison, and power, but with the tone of someone reading his own autopsy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sensationalize. He didn't have to. Episode titles came like quiet thunder: The Day We Killed, DiBerno, Why I Took Down Gotti, How the Mob Used Silence as a Weapon. Each one drew hundreds of thousands of views, then millions, then syndication. There were no apologies, no tears. Just an invitation to sit beside a man who had once sat beside death and listen while he opened the curtain just enough. Some called it redemption. Some called it reinvention. Others called it gall. You can't kill 19 people and come back as a storyteller, one New York journalist wrote. Gravano isn't just rewriting history. He's monetizing it. But Sammy wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for attention. And in America, attention redeems everything. He gave interviews, Vice, Vlad TV, even smaller YouTube shows run by kids who weren't born when Gotti went to prison. They asked him about honor, about the rules, about who he respected and who he didn't. They called him Sammy the Bull. He let them. But every once in a while, when the questions slowed and the camera lingered, his tone would shift. The performer would vanish, and what remained was the man who had walked too far down a path he could no longer see behind him. It doesn't leave you, he said once, staring through the lens. Even when you walk away, you carry it. His daughter returned to the spotlight, to Karen Gravano, now a reality television figure. Their shared fame wove them into the strange fabric of American culture, where families of killers and the killed could both have book deals, both have shows, both have fans. It blurred the line between narrative and truth, between legacy and brand. But Sammy's face aged, carved, raw remained the same. It was not the face of reinvention. It was the face of memory, of something That had been lived and would never be undone. In every episode, he would look into the camera and speak as if to no one in particular. I ain't a saint. I ain't asking for flowers. I'm just telling you what happened. And then he would tell you, and you would believe him. He didn't talk about therapy, about God, about salvation. He talked about structure, about command, about the chain of obedience that once wrapped itself like steel wire around every decision he made. He talked about sitting across from John Gotti and seeing his eyes glaze over. He talked about the moment he decided to flip. He talked about silence, how powerful it was and how it had died. He never begged for sympathy. He never denied the killings, but he really named the cost. Fans flooded comment sections with awe, anger, obsession. He's the real deal. He should rot. He's a legend. He's a rat. The paradox was the point. In some episodes, his voice would grow distant. He'd pause, then say something simple. I think about them sometimes, the ones we took out, not every day, but enough. And then the moment would pass. No music, no apology, just a silence you could almost hear through your headphones. What made it unsettling wasn't the violence, it was the calm. This wasn't a man haunted by what he did. It was a man who had simply accepted that it was the price of what he had once been. He had crossed a threshold no one returns from and learned to build a studio in the rooms. He had become a voice in the algorithm. Not feared, not worshipped, just consumed. Some watched him like a historian. Some watched like acolytes. Some watched to feel better about themselves. Some just watched because his voice, low, measured, grave, sounded like the last voice in the room before the lights went out. By 2021, our thing had millions of downloads. His name was trending. Again, he filmed documentaries, sat for retrospectives, became the subject of new books. People stopped asking why he flipped. They started asking how he survived. In the end, Sammy Gravano became the one thing neither the mafia nor the courts could ever predict. A brand. He outlived his era, outlived Gotti, outlived the streets he once ran. He wasn't a capo anymore. He wasn't an underboss. He was something else now, something American, the killer turned informant turned influencer, and every time he turned on the mic, leaned forward and said, "Let me tell you a story." You listened because somewhere in that quiet, cold voice was the sound of power that never needed to raise itself. There's an old superstition among made men, the kind that once mattered in the stone alleys of Bensonhurst or the smoke rooms of Mulberry Street. You don't speak the names of the dead, not the ones who were clipped, not the ones who flipped. You let the silence hold their memory, because to name them is to remember, and to remember is to give them weight. But Sammy Gravano never disappeared. He didn't go into the ground like Paul Castellano, crumpled beneath the red awning of Sparks Steakhouse in 1985. He didn't rot in a federal box like John Gotti, eating soup from a plastic tray until cancer claimed what the feds couldn't. He didn't vanish into witness protection and change. His name, growing tomatoes in Nebraska. No, Sammy survived. And that, more than anything, is what haunts the legacy of the American Mafia. He is a ghost who walks, not because he's invisible, but because he should be gone and isn't to some. He is the man who ended the Mafia, not with a gun, not with a war, but with truth. The underboss, who sat beside the boss, then pulled the curtain back on the theater of crime. The man who recited the rules of Cosa Nostra on national television, who uttered the names of capos, lieutenants, associates, and told America exactly how the sausage was made. But history is never so clean. Others say he only revealed what was already collapsing. The commission was fractured, the money was drying, the loyalty had become theater, and the new generation flashy, drug-dealing, camera-hungry operators like Gotti had already signed the death warrant. Sammy just read it aloud in Brooklyn. Today they still whisper his name. In Bay Ridge, a few corner cafes still bear photos of the old cruisemen in suits, arms slung around each other, eyes narrowed against the flash of a camera they didn't trust. And if you mention Gravano, some will spit, some will smirk, some will say nothing at all. Because what Sammy did wasn't just inform, it wasn't just betray, it was survive. And in the underworld, survival without loyalty is worse than death. He once described himself in one of his podcast episodes as a guy who lived both codes, the street code, the government code. He followed them both, then broke them both, and lived to talk about it. That is Gravano's legacy. Not the bodies, not the betrayals, but the paradox. He proved you could win the game by leaving the board. Legacy is a funny thing in organized crime. Some get statues in secret, toasted in back rooms with shots of sambuca and tears that never reach. The eyes, others get erased, their names removed from photos, their deeds absorbed by men who walked further, and some, like Sammy, become myths that you cannot fully embrace and cannot fully destroy. In the end, what did it all mean? The 19 murders, the oath, the empire, the trials, the prison cells, the plea deals, was it worth it? Maybe not even Sammy knows, he once said, in an offhand remark during an interview. When you outlive everyone, you stop asking who was right. It wasn't said with pride or regret, just the cold flatness of someone who'd long stopped counting the cost. And maybe that's the final punishment. Not prison, not shame, but living long enough to feel the silence of what you once commanded. Today, Gravano walks among the living, but he isn't one of them. He's something else, a man caught between eras, between laws, between stories. To the law, he is a cooperating witness. To the streets, he is a traitor. To the internet, he is content. To himself? That answer may be buried deeper than any grave. The 5 families are still here in name, but the power they once held, the grip they had on New York commerce, on the unions, on fear itself, that is gone. The streets have changed. The codes have faded. And in that vacuum, the last voice from the old world still speaks, not from a throne, but from a chair in Phoenix, behind a mic, wearing headphones and asking the world to remember a life that by all rights should have ended. Long ago, he ends his episodes with a phrase. Now it isn't flashy or sinister, just 4 words, quiet and sharp, asterisk. That's all for now, and maybe in some way it is, because there's nothing left to confess, no one left to bury, only the weight of having outlasted everything that once made you dangerous. They say ghosts don't haunt the living, they haunt the things they built, and so Sammy Gravano doesn't. Hover in graveyards, he haunts courtrooms, he haunts testimonies. He haunts the idea that the mafia could ever be untouchable. He is the one who proved that the code could be broken, that the myth could bleed, and that even the most sacred vows crumble in the shadow of survival. He may never be forgiven, but he will never be forgotten, not because of what he took, but because of what he left, a wound where honor used to be, a name that no one dares write in stone, just 4 syllables that still echo in every room where silence was once law. Sammy, the Bull Gravano.